Hello everyone and welcome. This is going to be the final part in my little series on how to build and fly space shuttles, and what we're going to be doing is taking what we learned in the previous 3 videos and applying that to building this NASA-like space shuttle, capable of taking up much larger payloads into low carbon orbit and manipulating them where it is you want them to be. As always, the idea being to teach the basic principles of building something like what you see here so that you can extend upon it and apply it to your own creations. So let's get started by taking a look at the orbiter. And here she is. As you can see, I'm trying to sort of go for like the space shuttle, the classic space shuttle type of look, though it's by no means meant to be a duplicate or replica of that. I did make some changes that I'll be getting to, but the one thing I want to say first is I've already done a video on designing a space shuttle orbiter, so I'm not going to go over this build and repeat those same details. If you want to, go back and take a look at that video. What I'm going to be doing here, though, is highlighting the differences and what extra things we do need to talk about and what makes this different than the previous shuttle that I did. And we'll start off with the engines here at the back. Number one is I do have the S3 KS-25 Vector liquid fuel engines. These are meant to replicate the real-life space shuttle engines. They have an incredible gimbaling range, which is really their thing, as well as a high amount of thrust, and they're going to be our liftoff engines when we go to lift this thing off of the ground, along with, of course, the external fuel tank and the solid rocket boosters that are going to go along with it. Once we're in orbit, though, we're going to turn these things off, and we're going to be using the Mk-55 Thud liquid fuel engines instead of using these big engines because they're way too powerful and not as fuel efficient as these two little guys are. The one thing that I did make sure of with the Thud engines is I turned off the thrust limiter on these while I was in the space plane hangar and made sure that if I put in my thrust vector and my center of mass vector for the vehicle, that those two line up nicely. And that's very simple to adjust. You simply grab this and you can drag that thrust vector up or down. It's important, though, when you're doing this that you have these off, or else no matter where it is in the staging, I can show you, the thrust vector will get affected by where this is as well. So if you want the thrust vector while you're in orbit, make sure that you turn off the engines that you will not be using when you are in orbit. Now, of course, the thrust vector from these guys, the vector engines, are important once we're lifting off the surface, but that's going to be taken care of in the VAB, not right now. Liquid fuel, there is if I go over to my Mk3 parts here, there is a rocket fuselage part. Stick it on the back here so you can see it, and that's the small one. There's a bigger one than that, but to me this contained just so much fuel I didn't want to use it, so I didn't use it. Instead, the liquid fuel is contained in really just 2 types of tanks. Up at the front here I have the Rockomax X200-8 fuel tank with liquid fuel and oxide. It's the smallest of the 2.5 meter tanks that come along in stock. And at the back here I have some additional liquid fuel in the form of 4 R-L Baguette external fuel tanks. And actually, while we're at the back, just to show something else that is kind of hidden in here, if I get the move tool, kind of sneak in here to take a look-see, there it is, and we can slide it out so you can see it. Having some extra reaction wheels is a nice thing to have, so I hid them back in there by tucking that away so that you don't really see them, and that gives me, of course, more cargo space. And looking at the cargo space, you can see I actually have not 1 but 2 docking ports here. This docking port is designed to let go of and grab again cargo. It's kind of nice to have actually a docking port rather than a decoupler, because you can also use this thing to grab and manipulate objects in space. Maybe you want to take something back down to the surface. And then I put a second one up here that we will be using when we are in orbit, putting in our space station parts. It's also nice to be able to dock to a space station using this one rather than this one. You can also take care of this using some robotic parts, but as I am not playing with any of the mods or any of the expansion packs in this tutorial series, I don't have any of those robotic parts available. This thing also has an RCS system, and I've talked about installing RCS before, but of course that means it does have monopropellant, and I do have monopropellant in two different locations. There's monopropellant in the cockpit, actually 100 units of monopropellant in the cockpit, but I've put a further 100 units of monopropellant in this Mark III monopropellant tank at the back. Just 100 units, because more is just way more than what I need. I mean, it can hold up to 2,100 units. But having two tanks, forward and back, is actually something that'll be useful, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But let's keep going. For the wings, let's close these guys. I don't think we need to see them anymore. I went with these what's designed to be space shuttle-like wings, the Big S Delta wing and the Big S wing Strake. These things can hold liquid fuel, but I didn't want it, so I simply just took the liquid fuel out and then disabled that tank so I don't end up filling them by mistake again at a later time. We also have here landing gear. I made use of at the back because this is a much heavier vehicle than previous planes that I've built in this series. So instead here we have the large, the LY-60 large landing gear. Still have the small retractable landing gear at the front, but the large ones at the back. One tip when it comes to attaching these, it looks like they're attached to the wings, but they're actually not. They're really attached to the fuselage, and then I translated them outwards to make them look like they're attached to the wings. The reason why I did that is because if you attach them to the wings, the connection between the wing and the fuselage is actually pretty fragile. It has a tendency to break when you land, even if you land at a fairly low speed, but the connection with the fuselage is much, much stronger. So this way you can get the landing gear where they look right, but they're really not attached to the wing and ready to break this silly joint apart. If you want to test this, a great way to test this is actually to get your vehicle maybe about 10 meters above the runway and drop it. If it can hit the runway and nothing breaks off, you're probably good for landing this thing. If stuff is breaking when you're doing that, you might want to think about doing things a little bit differently. And speaking of things breaking off, I did make sure to put on auto strutting and turn on rigid attachments, and I did that all through this vehicle. The wings still are kind of fragile. If you turn aggressively at high speeds, these can very easily break off. A way of fixing that, if you don't like it, I decided to live with it. I could fly it with it that way, but if you'd rather make them stronger, a whole lot of little struts like that can go a long way to even stiffening up further than that. And the last thing I want to talk about with this thing is its center of mass and center of lift. And if you take a look at this, you'll notice that I have the center of lift quite a ways back from the center of mass. And that's because when you are traveling at hypersonic speeds, like you are when you're coming down from orbit, the aerodynamic properties of the vessel change. Specifically, the ratio to the lift that you get from the wings to the lift that you get off the body changes depending upon your speed. At sort of normal atmospheric jet speeds, putting the center of lift close to the center of mass is a really, really good idea. But at hypersonic speeds, the center of lift tends to be further forward than what you are seeing here in the space plane hangar, so you need to compensate for that. And you can compensate for that by doing some test descents. So let's talk about descending this thing. Once again, I have done a video on how to descend a space plane before, so what I'm going to be concentrating on this time is what I'm going to be doing differently with this rather trickier vehicle to fly. If you need to refresh yourself, you can go back and check out this video right here. But why don't we get started with some of the things I'm doing a little bit differently. Number one is I want to get my center of mass as far forward on this vehicle as I can. So I'm starting off by selecting all of my liquid fuel and oxidizer tank. Remember, I got the 4 baguettes at the back and then the 2.5 meter tank at the front, and I'm transferring as much as I can into that 2.5 meter tank. I also have 2 tanks that hold monopropellant, the cockpit at the front and this monopropellant tank that's at the back. Once again, I'm going to transfer as much of the monopropellant as I can up into the cockpit to move that center of mass as far forward as I can. I'm also going to be pinning the menus for the monopropellant tanks to the side here because I want to access them during my descent so I can tweak the exact position of that center of mass. So here we are further down in our descent where the atmosphere is really starting to slow our vessel down, and I want to draw our attention to the bottom left of our screen. My SAS is on and my hands are away from the keyboard, but if you take a look at the pitch indicator, you can see that it is below the middle neutral position. That's the SAS trying to pitch the plane down. If the SAS were off, the plane would want to flip around backwards. You want to keep an eye on that pitch indicator. If it gets down to the bottom, that means the SAS has nothing else that it can do, and you're likely going to lose control of your vehicle. Now, what can you do to mitigate that? Number one is do what I've already done. Take as much of your fuel mass and push it as far forward as you can to bring that center of mass further ahead of the center of lift. But I've already done that. So the next thing I can do is I can pitch downwards to make the SAS not have to work as hard as it is right now. But if you're finding even with all that your plane is still flipping out, then you're going to need to take it back into the space plane hangar and do some redesigning. You can add in more reaction wheels to give your SAS system more oomph, but the simpler thing to do is to move that center of lift further back by adjusting where your wings and control surfaces are. Just be careful with that though, because remember, as the plane slows down, the aerodynamic properties of the plane are going to change, and you're going to find that center of lift is going to move further back all on its own, and you might find yourself as you approach the runway with the opposite problem of not being able to pitch up. That is why I have my monopropellant containers pinned to the right side of the menu. If all of a sudden I find that I have too much weight at the front, I can start pumping monopropellant back. I can do that, of course, with any of the resources, with liquid fuel or with oxidizer, but I actually found with this plane that I was pretty balanced as I was approaching the runway, and I didn't have to do that, but your results might vary. But that's enough on just the orbiter. Let's take a look at the entire vessel. And here she is. Here's our orbiter with an external fuel tank and 2 radial SRBs, just like the real shuttle. Now, I have already made a video on building boosters for space shuttles. I'm not going to go over all that again. If you need to, go check out this video. But what I am going to highlight are the differences in the design of this compared to that previous one. In particular, how do you deal with this awkward asymmetrical design here? And we'll get to that in just a little bit, but let's just go over very quickly the various parts, starting with the external fuel tank. There's only 4 parts here. We have 2 of these Kerbidyne S3-14400 tanks. These are 3.5 meter tanks. They hold a lot of liquid fuel and then just a couple of big nose cones on either end of it to kind of round it off. And of course, gotta paint it orange because, you know, that's what it's supposed to be, right? Is orange. And then attached to that, I do have a fuel duct, which is feeding fuel from our fuel tank to our orbiter, because remember, at launch, these vector engines are going to be engaged, and I don't want them draining fuel from the orbiter. So the fuel duct is to make sure that all the liquid fuel and oxidizer we burn is coming out of this tank, not from our orbiter. So our orbiter will be full once we ditch the tank. Attached to the tank are two radial SRBs. These are the S2-17 Thoroughbreds solid fuel boosters. Again, they're bigger than any of the ones you've seen in this series so far, but they are built basically for the job that you see here so that you can build yourself a sort of shuttle look-alike type of thing. Why don't we take a look at our payload? If we open up our doors, you do want to build this with your payload inside and adjust everything to that payload. You put in a different payload, you may need to make more adjustments. The payload here is pretty simple. It's just a science lab. I got some solar panels attached here, some docking ports and some batteries. That's about it. This is for demonstration purposes only. But if we take a look at our Delta V here, this thing has 4,972 meters per second of vacuum Delta V. That is a ton. That is way more than what it needs in order to just go into low orbit. So you can put in much heavier payloads than this. If you want to extend the shuttle, make it longer by adding more cargo bay space so you can pick bigger things in there, you should be able to do that, and the design principles here really aren't going to change. I should also mention the judicious use of struts here to secure our payload. Do make sure you do that, as well, of course, as struts on our SRBs and on the booster itself. You want to make sure, and the orbiter itself, so that you want to make sure everything is kind of held in there all right. Okay, let's close these doors. Now this thing has a lot of aerodynamic control surfaces, and we are most certainly going to need them when we are doing our descent, but during our ascent they actually are a hindrance. They provide too much of control authority and the whole thing becomes very twitchy, very difficult to fly. So what I did with every control surface you see here is I disabled them. No pitch, no yaw, no roll. So they're just all inactive. Once I am in space and ready to come back down, I will reactivate the ones that are appropriate. Don't forget to do that if you're going to do this, because if you come down with these all still inactive, you probably are in for a world of hurt. So every single one of these have been deactivated, including the canards up here at the top. It makes this thing much, much easier to fly. Now let's get into dealing with the whole asymmetry of this. Let's put in the center of mass, and you can see the center of mass is pretty much on the fuel tank, right? This fuel tank is the single heaviest component here. It has almost all of our liquid fuel and oxidizer in it, so that's where our center of mass is. But we have a kind of ugly configuration of engines here. If you just simply threw these vector engines on at the bottom, and then just hit, put it on the launch pad and go, this thing is almost guaranteed to flip out on you. And the reason is because you need to have the thrust vector go through the center of mass. So let's put in our thrust vector. There it is right there. And you can see that it is lined up pretty close to the center of mass. There is a lot of gimbal range, especially in these vector engines. They can handle it being off a little bit, which is a good thing, because as the fuel drains, this center of mass is going to move a little bit. Actually, it might move quite a lot. It's actually going to move in two different directions. Number one is I made the lower tank have a higher fuel priority than the upper tank. This one has a flow priority of 12, while the upper tank has a flow priority of 10. That means that this tank is going to drain first, and this tank will drain last, so the center of mass is going to drift upwards as we ascend and use up fuel. As well, this whole tank, as well as the SRBs, are going to get lighter as they use up fuel, so the center of mass will also drift towards the orbiter, as the orbiter is more of a share of the mass of the whole thing. What that means is, no matter where you set this all up, you're going to have trouble having this go perfectly through this all the time. It's not a big deal. There's a lot of vector range in these engines. They'll be able to handle it without too much difficulty. Now, how did I set this all up? Well, number one is I made sure this thing was going to be in the state it would be at launch. So if we take a look at our vector engines, I have the thrust limiter turned down, just temporarily for now. I have it down to give us a reasonable launch thrust to weight ratio. And then what I did is I turned these engines. If you see they're on a bit of an angle, I just simply used the rotate tool so that I can turn this engine, and you can see how that affects the center of mass. I wanted all of these to be turned in the same way, so I turned it to the point where it looked like this vector was going right through the center of mass. I also, by the way, turned off the thrust limiter on these orbital engines because they're not going to be part of our ascent. So that at launch, this is kind of the state of the engines that it's going to be. And then, once I was kind of happy that this was going close enough to where the center of mass is, well, if it was left like the real space shuttle, pointing straight up, so we'll turn this like that, the rocket's going to want to go off in this direction. It's going to take off a little bit sideways. And the real shuttle did do that. It took off a little bit sideways. Now, there's a reason why, I'm sure a very sound structural reason why, you couldn't tilt the shuttle on a jaunty little angle like this in the real world. I'm sure it couldn't stand the stresses of all of that and stand up under its own weight. But in KSP, that's not an issue. So why not turn the whole configuration so your thrust vector is going up so that when you launch, you go up? I don't know about you. I like going straight up, not necessarily off on an angle, going in the wrong direction. Getting ready for launch, though, I do want to make sure I put all of these thrust limiters back to full. At launch, we're not going to need all of this thrust, but as we ascend, we're going to need more and more thrust from these engines. We'll talk about it during our ascent. So I want to keep the thrust limiter at 100%. That means I need to remember at launch, I want our thrust setting, our throttle, to be set only at about 50%. I don't want it to be any more than that, and then I'll adjust it as I go up. Also, I should put on these thrust limiters on our orbital engines because we'll need them as well. This throws this off, but that's not the way it's going to be at launch, so I don't worry about it. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about before I leave this is, although it's fun to build a sort of shuttle type of vehicle like this, there's no reason in the game, other than maybe you want to have to build replicas of what was used in the real world. If you feel that this isn't working for you, you would like to put an engine down in here, you'd like to take this off and maybe, I don't know, stick a skipper engine on the bottom of that. Go ahead, do that. Doesn't matter. If that's what helps you fly the thing a little bit better, then do what your heart tells you to do. You don't have to copy everything that's done in the real world. So, let's launch this thing. And our mission is going to be to take our new science module and attach it to our space station, which I already have selected as a target. Notice as well that I have my throttle at 50% because that's what I need for an appropriate launch thrust to weight ratio. But with that all taken care of, there's nothing left but to hit spacebar and go. And just like with any rocket launch, I want to spend the first little bit doing my best to go straight up, at least till I'm about 50 meters per second in speed or so, and then I start pitching just a little bit over towards the east. And you can see this thing flies reasonably well, though it does take, it's a little bit more hands-on than I would say most of the rockets that you've seen in this series thus far. One thing to be careful about is that the thrust vector doesn't line up with where the ship is pointing on the nav bolt. So the thing to really look at is that prograde vector. That prograde vector is where the ship is actually going, and you need to get it to pitch over at an appropriate rate. Of course, I've talked a lot about launches before, so I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about launches. One thing I do have to pay attention to, if you notice, I've already increased my thrust. If you find this thing wants to fall over too quickly, that's because there's not enough thrust on that orbiter. Remember that the tanks are getting lighter as they go, so we need to increase the thrust on the orbiter as we go up. And we're getting very, very close to losing our SRB, so in just a moment we will stage those. There they go. And with the thrust of those SRBs now gone, I don't need as much thrust on my orbiter, so I can reduce the thrust there. I also can now point it to prograde, so I'm going to hit an action group. Watch the nav ball. Boink. Tucked at the back of the orbiter, I have a probe body which is tilted in the same way that those vector engines are tilted. And I used an action group to switch control to that probe body. Now, the ship icon on the nav ball does match the direction that the vehicle is actually going, and I can just simply lock to prograde like I would do in many other types of ascents and just control my throttle And while we continue with this ascent, why don't we take a moment to recognize our brave crew, Swanee, Flores, Martin, and Demesricon Kerman. And if they do not sound like normal Kerbal names, that's because they are not. They are just a few of the wonderful patrons that help to support this channel. Alright, we just cut off our engines because we have reached our target apoapsis. So we'll just flip this thing over, jump on up to our apoapsis, and finish off this insertion. Here you can see just how much the vessel is not pointing in the direction that the thrust is. And although there is still a ton of fuel in that external fuel tank, I'm going to ditch it while its periapsis is still in the atmosphere. So we're going to stage here, and then we'll just use RCS to clear the tank. And with another action group, I can engage my orbital engine, shut down the vector engines, and switch my control point back to the cockpit. There we go, and now the vessel's actually going to point in the direction that I want to go. And all I got to do now is wait to get very close to my apoapsis once again and just finish off this insertion. And as the rest of this is nothing that you haven't seen before in previous installments in this series, while we watch these folks manipulate the lab module and put it where it needs to be on our station, why don't I quickly summarize what I think are the two main ideas from this video. The first has to do with descending that orbiter and the fact that at hypersonic speeds, the center of lift will be further forward than what you see in the space plane hangar. To help mitigate that, move all your resources as far forward on the vehicle as you can, but also we talked about how you can monitor that pitch indicator to indicate how much control you really do have and how you can shift your resources back and forth to keep your vessel balanced. The second main idea came out of the vehicle assembly building and using the rotate tool to rotate our engines and make sure that our thrust vector passes through the center of mass of the vehicle. This is a really important feature if you want to keep that vessel pointing in the direction that you need it to. But I think with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. I hope that this video, along with its previous three, has really helped you in designing, building, and flying what are really some of the most challenging vehicles that you can build in this game. So I'm going to thank you for watching and hope to see you again next time.